Hello, you're listening to the Charles Bonnet Syndrome podcast. My name is Shaimond, and today is a special day. It's the 50th episode of the Charles Bonnet Syndrome podcast, and I have some special guests with me to help me celebrate. We have Eva Potts from Mary Carmel's Light. We have Scott Muirden from the Charles Bonnet Syndrome Foundation in Australia. Duchess Antoinette McDonald-Ellis, who has CBS, and she's also been a co-host on this podcast and does many things for the CBS community. And we have her husband, who's Ken Ellis. He's a caregiver and does many things for the CBS community. And we're also going to have a special recording from Judith Potts to give us some updates about Esme's umbrella. So how's everybody doing today?
Doing well, thank you, Shaimond.
Oh, that's great. It's so good to have you here. Thanks for helping to celebrate. Everyone that's on this podcast has been interviewed on the podcast, has been a co-host of the podcast. And also, Eva Potts had co-hosted like the first 10 or 12 episodes. So it's good to have you back. Appreciate that.
It's good to be here, Shaimond. And congratulations, by the way. You've made a really huge impact on the CBS community. Without this, the information wouldn't be out there. So congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everything you've done for the podcast and all you're doing with your organization. And of course, we're going to talk about that more. But I wanted to start with Scott because it's actually pretty late out there in Australia. We're recording this at 8 a.m. here in New York City where I live. And Scott is in, I believe, Melbourne, Australia, which might be 10 p.m. So thanks for making the sacrifice. And I'd like to start with you. If you can give us some updates with what's happening with your organization, anything you'd like to share that can be beneficial for the guests.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Shaimond. So I think something that might be of interest to your listeners is that there's a researcher up in Queensland called Vicki Hamilton, and she's doing a PhD on Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And she's nearing the end of that, so hopefully we'll get to be able to digest what she's come up with. But her situation is quite interesting on two levels. First is, in case people are not yet aware, Vicki Hamilton not only is conducting the CBS study, but she's also living with the syndrome herself. So it's fantastic to have someone within academia who has lived experience of the condition. So that's one great thing. And the second thing is that she's part of the Queensland School of Art and Design at Griffith University. So hers is quite interesting because rather than it, say, being more sort of neurophysiological, where you're looking at aspects of the neural circuitry in the brain and trying to work out that, she's taken it into, as the name implies, art and design. And what she ended up coming up with was 13 participants who are drawn from, I think about half are drawn from Australia and the remaining half worldwide. And what was interesting was that she was holding an exhibition of her work up in Brisbane, which is the capital of Queensland. And I made the trek up because I'm down in the very southern part of Australia, and I went up to see the exhibition. And it was really tremendous. And I think what I really loved about it was that, first of all, she had a lot of tactile cues to guide people who may be vision impaired through the space of the gallery. She also had Braille as an option if you wanted to know, to be able to identify what the work was and what it entailed. So she'd gone to quite a bit of an effort on that level. But then for people who are fortunate enough to have both vision and hearing modalities, she had this wonderful, well, there were many aspects to the gallery, but I think the principal one for me was that she had co-created with those 13 participants who are living with the syndrome and are sharing their stories. They co-created this series of works, including videos, images, and sculptures, to give it, hence that art and design focus, to really bring it to the fore through different sensory modalities to try to grasp what it's like to live with the syndrome. And she even had tactile representations of some of the visions people were having, which were really fascinating. And I think she developed them through 3D technology, which I don't claim to know a lot about, but I was very impressed with the final product. But I think one piece of her work that really impressed me was that she, with those 13 participants, she'd created this wonderful visual depiction. These were like short films, so it was like 13 vignettes all weaved into one another to create this CBS tapestry. And what was really interesting was that I suppose each one went for maybe, I don't know, 4 minutes or so. And not only did you get these truly wonderful visual depictions of what the person experiences, but also the person in their own words actually provided the voiceover to describe the sorts of visions they're having. So it complemented the visuals. So even if you couldn't see the visuals as such, you could draw upon the voice of the participant to learn more about it. I think the great thing about this work was its richness on many levels. And I told Vicki that we really need to promote this and get this out there to everyone, not just the general public, but this needs to reach aged care service providers and their staff. It needs to reach the medical fraternity, because I think part of the problem is if we just talk about clinicians, I think there's a I think there's a bit of detachment. They know a bit about the syndrome and what it entails, but that well-known phrase about try walking in another person's shoes for a few miles to really get a sense of what it's like. I think the type of artistic productions and sculptures that Vicki produced at the gallery is exactly the sort of thing that is quite compelling for anyone who watches it. We are a storytelling species, and there's nothing to get to the heart of trying to empathize with what others are going through than by through the telling of a story, one's story. And I think that it was just thrilling to be there to make the journey. And I was hoping to have a snippet for tonight, but with Vicky's permission, we will be releasing snippets, maybe one or two of those stories that can be shared widely. She knows what it's like to live with the syndrome. It's not purely theory. And so this gives her whole PhD undertaking many, many layers of value. And I told Vicki that we really need to spread this. And really what I see is that potentially once some of these vignettes get out there, that hopefully that can become a template or a blueprint for others within the CBS world to emulate or even surpass, that this can be the benchmark of how one starting benchmark of how we can start to engage more and more people, whether they're in the medical healthcare sector or just the general public, that there can be a quicker grasping of the CBS phenomenon.
Thanks for sharing that. And one thing that shows me is the importance of working together, because your organization, the Charles Bonnet Syndrome Foundation, is the oldest foundation in the world that's sole purpose is to help people with Charles Bonnet Syndrome and raise awareness and help caregivers. And you could have said, this is what my organization is doing today, but you focused on what Vicki's doing. And also you made a trek. Australia is a very big country, and you went from one part of the country to support her and view her work. So also, Esme's umbrella is supporting Mary Carmel's Light, and Mary Carmel's Light is supporting your foundation. Everybody's working together. I think that's great because all of us together, whether it's this podcast or whether it's somebody writing about something, I think they have a newsletter called Gleams that wrote about Charles Bonnet Syndrome, and that's for glaucoma. So I just appreciate you highlighting that. And I also interviewed Vicki Hamilton, and she spoke a little bit about that. So if there's anyone listening that wants to listen to the full episode, you can just type in Vicki Hamilton and it will come up. And I'm hoping that exhibit will travel to the States and I'll be able to see it here in the States. I said I'll go no matter where it's at. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Ken, if you wanted to say anything on your end, feel free to tell the people a little bit about who you are or any updates, because you've been also a guest on this podcast, and I appreciate all the things you've done to help it.
I and of course, Antoinette first, had an experience that I think is interesting, and that is we were at a symphonic concert the better part of a year ago. And as the symphony played, it created compositions in Antoinette's head that was directly related to the music she was hearing. And I happened to, when we got home, I had her put it down on something in terms of drawing, just so that, first of all, I could be clearer about what she was describing. But I realized that there were a couple of things in that. First of all, the fact that your environment can shape your events, particularly if you're hitting multiple centers, such as your capacity for taking in music and enjoying it and all of that. And then since I'm a scenic designer, I could not help but go to, wow, there could be some artistic efficacy here, in the sense that your CBS struggle doesn't have to be all horror, that you could conceivably integrate it into your life by actually creating based on what's going on with you. So I saw a kind of therapeutic element there, in that you take the pressure off of the whole dark story of it. And also it spoke to, I'm not sure how, but I think it spoke to this idea of making the experience more livable while you have it, particularly since we do not know when it's going to end, if it's going to end. So you begin to have to think about, okay, how do I make this some part of my existence? And I saw that as a fine opportunity to actually cite that.
I kind of like to speak to that a little bit. Yeah, because I do remember that symphonic experience very vividly. I do want to say not all of my CBS experiences are dark and frightening. Unfortunately, the ones that I tend to share are the ones I need help because I'm afraid or because they're dark. But Emma and Shaimond, as you know, we attend a group many Saturday mornings where right now it is the same. I consistently have a halo of cherubs that circle my head. Now, they're not dark and frightening. In fact, they kind of give me a little bit of a superpower, or feeling, if you will, of a superpower, because I like my protective halo. I've also had other experiences, one that I call my secret garden. And interestingly, I've never been the type of artist that draws things. I'm a performance artist. I'm a writer. But for whatever reason, with the CBS, I'm starting to come to an artistic place, whereas I can't see as well. I'm starting to actually, with my hand, with a pen, try to draw my experiences. And I believe that may be because these experiences are so clear, they're so strong, they're so, in some ways, invasive, because again, I never know when they're going to pop up, when I'm going to see whatever it is I'm going to see, when I'm going to be immersed into some strange, bizarre, sparkly place that no one else can engage but me. I love the idea that a PhD student has worked not only to write the document, but to create an artistic piece where it's not just her experience, but she and many others who have this Charles Bonnet. And I agree with you, Scott, that it does need to be far reaching. It needs to reach more people than just her PhD committee. It needs to reach more people than just the folks sitting here on this panel today. I think that has really long legs, not only in helping to understand, but I do have to say, as a performance artist, sometimes that expression just needs to get out. And so that's also an audience for that. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you. And by the way, thank you, Shaimond, for inviting us to be here on this special 50th episode as well.
Thank you so much for joining. There's actually two things. Hopefully, I can remember both things. But the first thing I want to say, it's a story that I've shared a lot, and I've even shared it on this podcast. There's someone whose name is Nina Chesworth, and she works with Esme's Umbrella. She's like a volunteer, and she does things for the CBS community. And I joined one of her groups that she had, a support group, with the person that I'm a caregiver for. They joined also. So the first thing she said in this support group is she said, "Tell me your funniest experience with CBS." And I said, and the reason I'm saying this is because Ken just said your experience doesn't have to be horrible, all horrible. And I said, so the first thing I said to myself is, what are you talking about? CBS is horrible. It's nothing good about it. It's just a terrible syndrome. I thought this in my head, but I would never say that. But then everybody in that group went around and said something funny. And I said, wow, so brilliant. It's just for a moment to think outside the box and just to think, just to even say that. I said, and I told her that, I said, I commend you for saying that and thank you for her approach. And she doesn't do groups no more because she's busy and stuff like that. But I feel like she has a gift for leading them groups. And that was something that was just so brilliant.
I mean, I've certainly had funny experiences, and without taking up too much time, one time we were at a restaurant that we go to quite frequently. And all of a sudden, I saw Santa Claus at the counter. Now, mind you, we were nowhere near Christmas. And I said to Ken, is Santa Claus standing over there? He was like, where? And I pointed to where I saw Santa Claus, and he was like, no. But what was interesting, that CBS experience was so strong, the gentleman who was standing next to Santa Claus, or I guess Santa Claus was standing next to him, depending on your point of view, I had to go speak to him before we left the restaurant. And I suggested to him, I was like, do you do Santa Claus at Christmas time? He was like, no. I said, we might consider it and think about it. And he just laughed. He says, well, I've thought about it. And I said, I think you'd be a good Santa Claus. I've had many experiences like that. But that to me is just the first one that pops into my head because it was so out of context. We were in an Italian restaurant in the middle of summer in Texas. It's like 1,000 degrees outside. And here I am seeing Santa Claus next to a gentleman. But
when she mentioned that, we were both there. And that gave me some insight as to one of the vast number of ways that CBS's functionality. Because what was in the frame, as it were, was a Coke machine with the red and the white. So I saw that the CBS experience does not have to be encapsulated in what seems like a fantasy. It can actually make use of what's in the environment and transforms it into an element in the experience. So I thought that was really interesting because a lot of the descriptions of events are immersive. And Antoinette talking last week about the sheer cliff while she was camping. It was entirely immersive. But in this case, information was drawn from the environment and then reconfigured into a thing. So I thought that really, really fascinating.
That's really fascinating, Kenneth and Antoinette, because I also have come across a lot of people who've had experiences where their CBS appears to be induced environment. Not always, but sometimes. And I'm thinking of, in particular, one comes to mind. A gentleman said he was watching television, and as a lot of people know, we don't quite know why, but one of the biggest triggers for CBS seems to be watching television. He was watching television and it was a documentary on the Second World War. And it was about 20 minutes in, and lo and behold, before him, just standing to the left of the TV screen, were two life-size soldiers from World War II. And there's definitely something to what Kenneth and Antoinette just talked about. That definitely is a facet of the syndrome where something that you're listening to on audio description or some conversation you're having, it can have an influence on one's visual field. I think that's an area that really hasn't been explored much up until this point in time. Personally, I'm interested in what role the psyche plays. And we don't hear a lot of that in CBS literature about the role of psyche. It's more about, I don't know, it feels more scientific at times and clinical in a lot of the readings that one can consume. And so I think it's a very rich area. And I guess if Antoinette's a writer and a creator of sorts, then I'd be interested to hear from her whether she's using any of those sorts of themes in any of her work.
Actually, I am. I'm writing a piece about my blindness journey. And of course, part of that journey is my CBS. That was the secret little gift that I was given. It's called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to Blindness, my glaucoma story. But included in that is a chapter about CBS because, like many people, before I started having the effects of CBS, right, I'd never heard of it. I didn't know what it was. And that is obviously part of my journey with my vision loss. And so I thought, how could I not include that? So not only will it be a book, but also a performance piece. And actually I shared with both Shaimond and Eva a poem I wrote in regards to CBS. It's called A Love Note to Charlie B. And because I feel like art, writing, and not just medical and technical writing, really is what explains CBS, because many of us who live with this on a daily basis, I'm no doctor, I'm no medical professional, but I am one that every day deals with CBS, whether I want to or not. So I feel like it needs to be expressed more than just in the journals, more than just in the PhDs. And I think that's wonderful that she did that. And not only that, she incorporated art. So that's more inviting. So yeah. So I have started to do that and will continue to do that. That's actually part of my survival with it, to tell you the truth.
In our constant discourse about this, we speak about it, talk about it, question it all the time.
Yeah.
The aspect of the psyche, interestingly enough, seems to be a core realm to even consider CBS at all, particularly as we hear about the many experiences that people in our group share. There does seem to be some process around the symbology within your own psyche that gives you a lot of the content of these things. We talk about what we heard others say to try to suss this out on our own world here. Why is it that the room is full of these people you don't know? What's up with that? What is the symbology of that? Or the chuck wagon with the dancing girls.
That's one of my CBS events.
Where does this come from? What does it symbolize? Where does it reach from?
And don't forget Buzz Lightyear.
Buzz Lightyear's there too. So some stuff you could get to. Buzz Lightyear, she knew who he was, and he was someplace in one of her psychic drawers.
But so, why he follows the chuck wagon and the can girls around my table, we don't know.
But, I think that when I hear some of our other I hate this term, but sufferers,
Those living with it.
those living with it, who have these frightful experiences. We speculate a lot about, okay, why these frightful experiences? Are we talking about unresolved stuff from childhood? Or whenever. It could be anything in those categories, leading to the conclusion that certainly a huge percentage of these experiences are about, I call it, things from your psychic chest. You have a chest of drawers, and Charles Bonnet can select drawers, perhaps randomly, perhaps not, to draw out memories, imagery, things that touched you at some point in your life where maybe you weren't even aware that they touched you in a certain way, but they happen to find a drawer to live in your psyche. And now that you have this mechanism, and I think lately I've been thinking of CBS as a kind of mechanism. Because yes, there's a lot of discussion from a kind of clinical or sick person aspect, which I think sometimes can draw us away from some definition of this thing as a functionality. And one of our discussions goes to, could you get some control over this? Is it possible that you could direct and nudge the CBS mechanism to perhaps serve you better? Because it seems that in the art realm, bringing this back full circle, it seems to give you lots of opportunity. I mean, that was where my entry point in her discourse was. I was thinking, because I'm an artistic, greedy person, so or ambitious, I should say. So I started thinking, hey, man, is there work in this? You know what I mean? And so I don't know, but that whole aspect of the psyche seems to be somewhat central.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think it's good to always stay curious. And I didn't forget about you, Eva. It looks like you want to jump in, but I had one question for Antoinette. I'll let you share your own stories, but you've told me and you've told other people in the support group that we go to every week that you have a certain person that appears in the bathroom when you go at night. This person that keeps coming every night. And then you also said you have the cherubims that are like constant. And you also said you have I feel like you said an Amish card that comes out when you're on the highway and stuff. So I just thought about this question, and sorry to put you on the spot, but like, what percentage of your CBS hallucinations, I'm going to say, do you think are things that are recurring or things that are just the same character or the same situation or cherubims every day? And what percentage is something that's maybe more spontaneous, for lack of a better word, something different? Like, how often does it change, or do you continue seeing a lot of the same things? Hopefully that was a clear question, but I was just curious if you had any insight into that.
No, it was a clear question. And interesting, maybe 2-3 months ago, I said to the group, I'm having a cast change. And maybe I just think of it that way because I'm in the entertainment world. But it seemed, because the cherubs, they're my consistent companions. The gentleman in the bathroom, can I say who that is? Every night when I get out to go to the bathroom at 3 a.m, Snoop Dogg is sitting in my bathroom, in the chair in the bathroom. Every morning at 3, he's there. The Amish carts, that does seem to be a recurrent thing while on the highway, interestingly. They don't show up on the roads. But I feel I have consistent ones, but then they'll have a time when it's a turnover. And so when I said, I feel like I'm having a cast change, because then I started getting new images, but they will often repeat themselves. I know you've heard me talk about being chased by the trees in the dog park. Now, mind you, I get it. That's probably seasonal because of when the shadows cast here in Texas. Now it's almost 9 o'clock at night before we get shadows under the trees. So when it's time for a 6 o'clock walk, it's not an issue. But in fall and springtime, the trees tend to chase me, which kind of ties into something someone brought up a little bit earlier. The first time the trees began to chase me, I was actually noticing my shadow being cast on the ground, and my shadow was dancing. I was not, my shadow was. But then the trees, their shadow began to chase me. And I remember thinking to myself, I'd much rather dance with these trees than run from these trees. So that next night, same thing, dog had to go to the bathroom, same time, at the dog park. So once again, the trees began to move, the shadows of the trees. And I was like, nope, we're going to have a dance party because I'm not running from you. I went through my checklist. Okay, first of all, is it likely that this is actually happening? No. So can I see it full 2020? Yes. Must be CBS. Therefore, it cannot harm me. So I thought, okay, let's dance then, because the dog still had to go to the bathroom, whether I was afraid of the tree shadows or not. So I decided at that point that as opposed to letting the trees chase me, those trees and my shadow, we're going to have a dance party. So for fall and spring, there's a dance party with me and the tree shadows. So I think that was a very long and unclear answer to your question, Shaimond. So let me try to summarize and make it a little clearer. Yes, I have recurring ones that happen most of the time. I do have surprise visitors periodically, but it seems that they come in waves for me.
Thank you. And I want to let you speak right after this, but I just wanted to make a quick response to what Antoinette said, Eva. You said that they can't harm you. And I think that's so important for someone that has CBS to say, because we can sit around here as supporters and advocates or researchers and say things, but when you say it yourself and you understand that and you know that, that means a lot, because I've heard some horrible, horrific things, but the person that shared it is still alive. They lived through the night. They're beyond that. It's rough and it's traumatic, but it's not hurting them. They may think it's hurting them because they'll say it was, they're trying to intimidate me or whatever the case may be, but it hasn't hurt them. Now it could be hurting them psychologically because your mind attaches what you see to gives it. Sometimes you can't help but give meaning to things. I was talking to someone else about that. I think it's just natural to just give meaning to things. Why did this person do this? Maybe because of that. Or even when you're young, you start to realize, okay, well, when I do this, when I cry, the person gives me food or changes my diaper. You kind of start to make some kind of thoughts and processes and stuff. But I think that's so important when you said it can't hurt you. And that's especially good to come from you because you actually have CBS. And that is true as far as the research and as far as everybody says. So thank you for sharing that. Eva, feel free to give an update about Mary Carmel's life, say anything that's interesting about CBS. Feel free. The floor is yours. And thanks again for all of the things you've done for the podcast, being a co-host for many episodes. And thank you.
You humble me. Thank you. And I find it very interesting and intriguing to sit and listen to Antoinette and Ken, because when all this started, we didn't have that input, that strong sense of agency over Charles Bonnet syndrome that Antoinette has, and her description of how she lives with it and is empowered by the support that is given from the group and what we've been doing. And I think that has a lot to do with how people handle their Charles Bonnet. We've had a lot of discussion other than Scott, because it's hard to communicate with him so far away sometimes, but we've had that discussion, just to backtrack a little bit, about personality type. And if you are a positive person, a creative person, if you're a fear-based person, if you're an anxiety-driven person, depending on personality types, we would find this spectrum in the Charles Bonnet syndrome world, almost like autism, like based on personality type, how your Charles Bonnet syndrome experience is going to flow. Antoinette, learning and becoming friends with her and understanding her journey, I find her to be a very positive person, always trying to see the sunny side of things, even though this has been a very difficult journey. It's always trying to find the positive things in life. And I believe that gives her experience a different type of, it's a different experience. My mother was fear-based, so I can speak to that. She had a very anxiety-driven personality. And I think that her CBS experience was a little different because she was always so fearful. And I think if you're fearful, your CBS can be a darker, nightmarish experience than having that positive personality. And we've talked about that before too, Shaimond. And I think when you're talking about the effects, I don't see how it couldn't affect the psyche. So if you're constantly And we know people in our support group that have a 24/7 experience with Charles Bonnet. How can you process that without ending up with some type of anxiety disorder, PTSD, or even into a state of some psychosis? We don't want to jump into the mental health world with this, but unfortunately, since it's not being recognized and treated properly, diagnosed properly, we're giving all this time to this syndrome that could have a different outcome because research isn't being done, especially in the United States. And the more time we waste on not paying attention to it, I think the more damage is going to be done in the world of Charles Bonnet syndrome. They're finding that in the study in the UK that Esme's umbrella is doing right now with children is they're discovering that the problem is not the children talking about their Charles Bonnet syndrome, it's the parents accepting it and wanting to move forward and exploring the fact that their child may have Charles Bonnet. Another thing we have to remember is this is not just a 55 and older syndrome. This affects anyone at any age, at any time, without warning. The impact is sudden, and confusion and fear set in right away. You're dealing with problematic situations right from the beginning because it's not being recognized. And in the children that they're working with in the UK, they're finding that the ability or the possibility of having some more traumatic psychological problems may occur because it's not being addressed properly. I can tell you from the phone calls that Mary Carmel's Light has had, or we've had young people or parents of young people, they feel like they have Charles Bonnet syndrome. They don't know where to turn. Could they come to support group? And I'm like, absolutely. There wasn't one parent I talked to, and I've talked to 7 so far, solidly for over a week, waiting to come to support group. And every one of those parents talked about their child's suicidal ideology. And as I've grown I've learned so much from the people who live with it, from caregivers. I have learned so much from the visually impaired world. We forget that many times, and caregivers, I want to let them know that we understand you and we empathize with you, because the person that is losing their vision, that's hard enough on them. Their visual acuity is dropping. They may be going blind. That is a challenge all by itself. And then you give Charles Bonnet is given to them. Now they have 2 challenges. And as a caregiver, you're taken aback. And I know it happened to me. It was hard enough watching my mom lose her vision and go blind. And then when I realized she was dealing with something else on top of it, yeah, life isn't fair. How do I make it fair for her? How do I help her? How do I keep her quality of life intact? Because the things that I am learning about visual impairment are overwhelming to me at times, because the challenges that people with visual impairment face, aside from Charles Bonnet syndrome, are overwhelming environment. People allowing them their space and to navigate the environment, having empathy like you would for anybody else. And as a society, I'm just shocked at the lack of, and for lack of a better word, people just aren't, okay, all I can do is speak for Americans. Our eyes aren't open. We're not paying attention to the visually impaired world. When somebody has a visual impairment, it's almost as if they just are ignored. And that should not be what's happening. It should be inclusive. Dignity, it has to be inclusive. We have to treat everybody with respect, like anybody with a challenge. But I'm finding more and more, the more I learn, is that visually impaired people are facing the challenge once their visual impairment drops. And my mother used to say this to me. She said, why does everybody think I'm losing IQ points all of a sudden just because my vision is declining? And my mother, like most visually impaired people I talk to, was highly intelligent, but the way people responded to her after she lost her vision was almost really hit her dignity. And then to get the dementia diagnosis, which she didn't have because it was misdiagnosed, it was Charles Bonnet syndrome, but they slapped a dementia diagnosis on her. Then you got 2 whammies against you, and you're still dealing with Charles Bonnet. And in the words of Judith Potts, 2 things can be true at once. You can have CBS and something else can also come along. But I think you know where I'm going here. I'm trying to explain too much, but learning about Charles Bonnet syndrome has really made me understand more about the visually challenged. aspect of it. We forget that's the first thing people are dealing with. And they don't have the space to deal with that before Charles Bonnet is like, well, here I am, like it or not, I'm here. And it makes me more empathetic towards people with Charles Bonnet and visual impairment, because that's a double whammy nobody needs, wants, or deserves. So Mary Carmel's Light was formed out of going to support group after mom passed away and working through my grief in support group and realizing nobody's doing anything in America to help. Nobody's doing anything. And then I thought, nobody wakes up one day and says, I think I'll start a nonprofit. I did. But nonprofits are driven from a place of passion and purpose and a call to action. And when I kept going to support group and kept hearing everybody talk about their misdiagnosis, lack of diagnosis, doctors not paying attention, family members and caregivers who didn't understand, that couldn't help them cope with what they were going through, I realized something had to be done. And with your help, Shaimond, and Gary and Judith's encouragement, and even Scott at a certain point, something has to be done in the US. And so we started. It took a little while to get where we are. We got our 501c3 in January 14th of 25. And we've been on several speaking engagements, attended several events. Antoinette and Ken have some events scheduled. I'm going to the Governor Moorhead School of the Blind and Deaf next week to do the very first professional presentation that Mary Carmel's Light will be doing in person. I'll be in front of doctors and everybody from the medical community. So I'm hoping that's going to make a difference. Because here in the United States, I hear Scott talking about how things are being done in Australia. I watch everything being done over in the UK, and I'm like, oh, when are we going to get our chance to get in there? And who's going to pick up the baton and say, okay, I'm going to go to battle for the people with Charles Bonnet syndrome. I'm going to make the difference. I'm going to get that designated billing code for them. I know I say that all the time, but it's true. We need a designated billing code. Designated to treat Charles Bonnet so that plan of care can be done, so treatment options can begin, and more importantly, research. But, I agree with Scott that it's not just the medical community, it's the entire community that needs to understand not only visual impairment, but Charles Bonnet syndrome. They go hand in hand. National Federation for the Blind, we connected with them after the Hadley podcast that we just did not too long ago. The response has been overwhelming. Every day in my email, I get somebody coming to the contact page on our website and saying, hey, send me that information. I've had 125 responses. That doesn't seem like a lot, but just in the last couple of weeks, that is a lot when you're sending out emails and writing personal emails. And I always tell them about this podcast. So we're coming along, we're rolling, and we're going down a path that I think is very positive, and we have to keep growing. However, we do operate on charitable contributions. So anybody out there, know that we're going to be here, but only through kind donations. And I got 2 board members, my treasurer is sitting here with me. So if I don't say something, I hope I've answered your question, Shaimond. There's just so much to talk about with Charles Bonnet syndrome. You could talk about it for hours. We know that, because it seems like we never get through a whole discussion without something new developing or a new idea popping up. But the last thing I want to say is, I think more than anything, we need to normalize Charles Bonnet syndrome. You go to the doctor for accident or eye injury, or you're at your optometrist or your eye doctor, and they say your visual acuity is dropping. Right then and there, that professional should say to you, you might experience something called Charles Bonnet syndrome, and it comes on suddenly. We don't have a treatment, we don't have a cure, but here are some resources, if nothing else, because when it hits and you don't know what you're dealing with, it's more damaging than having some idea this might be what we're dealing with, and being able to do the research, find the podcasts, find the websites. I had to go to the UK to find help in the US. It shouldn't be that way. So hopefully all that is changing.
Yeah, thanks for everything that you're doing. Thanks for all of the stuff that you shared. And I was just doing research online, and I came across some article that said there's something along the lines of there's like a 20% chance that you'll have a better experience or to be less frightening if you are aware of CBS before it happens to you. Similar to what you said, if optometrists or ophthalmologists say, hey, this is something that could happen, it's not a guarantee that it will happen. And as a matter of fact, most of the time it doesn't, from what we know. Who knows? Because some people aren't forthcoming about hallucinations. So it could be a 50-50. Some people think 30%, but that can really be helpful. So I know it's happening because you wrote a letter. Also, Judith Potts wrote a letter that people can take to their doctors, and I've done it with the person I'm caregiving for, so it's very helpful. And I wanted to touch a little bit on something you said in the beginning. It's estimated that 1/3 of people that have CBS actually have the horrific visions and the frightening kind of visions. And then, this is just my experience from being in support groups and listening, the people that do have the horrific experiences tend to get anxiety or be anxious or get sleep deprived, because they say it's every time I go to sleep, it's something on my dresser or some. And then from everybody knows this, when you're sleep deprived and if you have anxiety and high levels of stress for a long period of time, it's going to cause other problems. And that's not to say that CBS is a mental health condition, because it's not. We don't want to go against the research, but the things that can accompany CBS when you have the frightening kind, the more severe case, I'm going to say, if it is a spectrum or something like that, can be something that I would like to look into a little more. And maybe it's not just necessarily conducting research with people that have CBS, but just maybe who have sleep deprivation, or you can piece things together. I don't know. I'm not a researcher, so maybe that's out of line, but somehow, some way trying to connect the dots. And then how do you do that? Because I thought about having a sleep specialists come on this podcast and talk. And I think it's good, because anything that can improve the life of someone with CBS is good. And I can branch out and start doing that. But then again, it's one thing to say, drink some chamomile tea. I don't know what they would say. I'm just making this up. Or take a little melatonin or something. But then again, if you are having a dragon or a bear or some demon or something like that's just happening, it's hard to say to drink the tea and maybe get some rest when those types of things are going on. Then this popped in my mind. I know I'm all over the place, but there have been people that I've spoken to that we say there's a list of things that you can try, coping mechanisms and things that can maybe help. And one of them is wearing an eye patch. And I've spoken to numerous people that said they put the eye patch on and they say it doesn't matter. They close their eyes and they still see CBS in their eyelids. But then I've spoken to numerous people also that say the eye patch helps, but they don't like to wear the eye patch because they don't know what's happening or going on outside of them. They can't see. And I said, that is an interesting statement, because the eye patch can give you relief, but you don't want to wear the eye patch because you don't know what types of hallucinations are happening outside. And they know, and they'll say, I know they're not real, but then they'll say, I want to see I don't want things happening around me. So there's so many facets to this. And I think it goes back to your personality, your upbringing, your level of stress, or whatever. But feel free if anybody wants to respond to this or anything else. I'll stop talking there.
I did want to say something about the experience that Antoinette had with the music, because my brother's in the music industry and he started this music therapy type of thing years ago. And when Mom started, when we understood Charles Bonnet, my brother said, hey, music therapy. And it worked for Mom. And not only because music can be a distraction, but it's a frequency. And so the part of music therapy that's interesting, like cognitive behavioral therapy, so that, not that they work hand in hand, let me separate the two, I'm sorry. So music therapy is a great distraction. When Mom would be in a really bad episode, we would play her favorite song. And it would snap out of it because it would bring her back to a pleasant memory, a pleasant time in her life when she was like, oh, that distraction. And it brought her back to a positive place, not a negative place. And cognitive behavioral therapy had worked on Mom because it helped her deal with the things in her life that were causing the anxiety, things that she had not dealt with before that did intensify her CBS experience. And once she was able to deal with those anxieties and those fears, those hallucinations disappeared and lessened significantly. So because of the lack of research, we're having to into the realm of other therapeutic interventions, because you want whatever works, whatever is going to help this person get through it. All the art and therapy that Vicki is doing, how intriguing. I mean, whatever is going to work, that's what we need to be focused on, not whether or not it crosses a border, Yes, I get it. I understand it. We don't want a mental health stigma attached to it because it's already there. People that present with CBS are already, oh, there's some psychosis there, or there's some mental health issue. No, it's physiological. But people in the medical field aren't getting the message because they don't understand CBS. And we could talk about this all day long and go in circles because it seems so cyclical. But once they start paying attention and start understanding this, maybe, and make a difference and do some research, all these therapeutic interventions I think are still going to be there in that tool belt that Antoinette talks about. But I can see where that music interaction with her happened because as blind as my mother was, my mom could, when she heard music, she could see like Antoinette. She couldn't draw like Antoinette does, but she would tell me how the music made her feel and what colors she saw. And I think that was pretty interesting. Antoinette's shaking her head. So I think that music is very powerful. And I'll stop there.
So now we're going to take a moment to hear from Judith Potts, the founder of Esme's Umbrella in the UK. She's a fearless leader and supporter and advocate of CBS, and she was not able to join us here today, so she actually sent in a recording. So let's take a moment to hear some updates from her and hear what's going on with Esme's Umbrella.
Hello everyone, and my apologies for not being able to join you today. First of all, many congratulations and a big thank you to Shaimond on such a successful podcast. 50 is truly amazing. Reflecting on the last 9 years, I am delighted to be able to say that awareness of CBS in adults is now considerably higher in the UK than it was when I launched Esme's Umbrella. Of course, there are still people who self-diagnosed incorrectly and assume they've developed a mental health condition. Consequently, they confide in no one. But many of these people are now able to use a computer and are discovering one of us. However, Professor Dominic Fitch, who is chair of Esme's Umbrella and the World Authority on Visual Hallucinations of all types, has proved that if a warning is given before that first hallucination appears, the outcome is so much better, because obviously the person thinks, oh yes, I remember being told about this. Educating the doctors of all specialties is top of my list. Ophthalmologists and optometrists are, on the whole, talking to their patients about CBS, but there are some who conveniently forget to do so. However, our general practitioners, that is our family doctors, are woefully lacking in knowledge, and so are the hospital A&E or emergency room doctors. In this country, we have a CVI form, a Certificate of Visual Impairment, which is signed by the ophthalmologist when someone's sight has deteriorated so much that they can be declared blind, and that way they can get help, financial help. On the new form, which is about to come out, I hope, if this government gets its act together quickly, there are 2 mentions of Charles Bonnet Syndrome, which means that the doctor will have to talk to the patient. So I'm keeping my fingers tightly crossed that they don't just tick the box. But I think our patients' families are now very much more aware. And if they see something they don't understand, they will simply ask. So either way, for those particular people, CBS might be a little more understandable to them. Esme's Umbrella has been running an annual essay competition for medical students, and we have one underway again this year. There's a financial prize and a certificate for the winner. Even those who don't win the prize have had a swift CBS education to carry into whichever medical specialty they choose. So I feel we are starting to educate the next generation of doctors. Children and young people have been my focus for the last 18 months. Since Professor Maria Musiji and Dr. Lee Jones proved that this age group could also develop CBS, we have been working on how best we can support them and their families or caregivers. If only half of the children with sight loss in the UK also live with CBS, we could be talking about a possible figure of 20,000. Goodness knows how many in America or Australia. What we have discovered is that children are not talking about their visual hallucinations, partly because in the older age group, their reaction is the same as an adult, and partly because they have seen how upset their parents are because of the sight loss diagnosis, and they don't want to upset them any further. Conversely, the parents are either in denial about CBS, which we have found in some communities, or they feel so burdened by the sight loss diagnosis that they simply cannot handle anything else. Either way, the children are losing out, so we have to find the right way to encourage them to talk about what they see. To that end, our animated film M is working well for younger children, and the 20-minute film Aspectum has been watched by quite a few of the older age group. Parents to whom I've spoken talk about their children seeing monkeys, dogs, bugs on the bed, frightening faces, and many children need a trusted adult to sit with them until sleep takes over. This reinforces our knowledge that tiredness exacerbates CBS. Persuading parents, caregivers, teachers and guardians that CBS exists is proving more difficult, and I feel that this campaign, Esme's Children and Young People, is going to be even harder than the original one for adults, but I will persevere. Interestingly, it was from a child that I discovered that a sound can trigger an episode of CBS. This young person was refusing to go into the music room at school because he said he was seeing unpleasant images when he did so. The teachers were not accepting this and were angry with him. His habilitation officer contacted me and asked if I thought the child would know about CBS, which obviously I very much doubted. So I talked to Professor Fitch, and he described a very recent piece of research which proved exactly that. A sound, in some cases, can trigger an episode of CBS. So I was able to put the teachers right. And just this morning, it was pointed out by someone who actually thought that a painkiller was making their CBS worse, that actually it was a dental infection. So we now need to add that to all the other infections, usually chest or urinary tract. But now Professor Fitch is thinking we need to add a dental infection too, which will make it worse. So I'm about to round up all my researchers and ask for an update from them all. Researchers are notoriously bad at keeping me up to date with their findings, but when I do ask, I realise how fast the understanding of CBS is developing. The journal Therapeutic Advances in Ophthalmology is due to publish all the CBS research, and I am so proud that the UK has led the world in this field. There's also a book which is being written by, again, the researchers, and they've asked me if I would write the foreword about launching Esme's Umbrella, why I did it, and the story of the charity, which I am delighted to do. So once that book is out, we must all buy it. That will sell just a few copies, but never mind. And lastly, I was given a very unexpected award recently for the work that I have done since the age of 70. I am now 76. And I am being ruthless in exploiting this award for the good of the whole CBS community around the world. Thank you so much, and I will listen to the podcast with great interest.
Thanks so much for saying that, Judith, and sending that message in. And thanks for all of the work you're doing. And it is so important, and we appreciate the things you've done and will continue to do. I do want to say Lucia Ricardo did join us today, but she was having technical difficulties, so she had to drop from the call. So thanks for putting up the effort and just trying to be a part of this. And she may send in a message to give you any updates or share her perspective on this milestone.
Congratulations, Shaimond, on your 50th episode anniversary of the Charles Bonnet Syndrome podcast. What an amazing accomplishment in a very short time. Just a year ago, there was nothing like it. And now here it is. Just a wonderful assembly of so many different voices and experiences and knowledge about Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And congratulations to all the people who have been featured and who continue to work so hard to promote awareness of Charles Bonnet Syndrome. Wishing you so much more success. I'm still out here creating awareness as often as I can on Charles Bonnet Syndrome, and we can all do that in very simple ways, meeting new people, letting them know about what it is, and that's something that we all can continue to do. So all the best for continued success. I'll be listening, and thank you all for the work that you're doing. Bye for now.
I want to circle back to something that Eva touched on that connects to the event that Scott related to us. Because given the way society seems to function, it seems that the way for this discussion to happen at large, a path to that may be artistic production. Because artistic production creates many things, not the least of which is media attention. And since we are so greatly mediated, that may be a wedge in to a larger, far-ranging cultural discussion that normalizes these things. One of the things that I thought of as a specific thing is that the scholar, her name is Vicki, correct? I was thinking some kind of online slideshow that simply shows this art to anyone who might land on it, begins to create a place to start a discussion. That's just one thing. It could be any number of iterations. Because I think that our separateness as individuals on Earth, it's easy for insensitivity to be present. And that's largely because these people have their own lives and traumas. So they're busy focused on their personal trauma, which might be their boss at work. But I think that if we're able to put things out there that capture attention, that's one small way to spread this discourse across societies at large.
Art is so important because I've spoken to artists on this show, some who are blind and have no light perception, and they still make art. And that just is amazing to me. And there's also in Italy, there's a whole museum that is actually a tactile museum for people with visual impairments. And one person is like a curator at that exam affiliated with them. And there's so many different things. So if you have tactile art, and if you have stage plays, and if you have academics and researchers, and then you have people that are just supporters and stuff like podcasts and other people, everybody coming together playing their part, we never know where the breakthrough will happen, because most of us want some kind of a pill that you can take and it goes away, but it may be something else. Because sometimes you can have an experience at a play because art is so powerful and it could speak to you so well that it could change your life. You leave that theater and you're different. And that could happen with CBS or something else. So thank you for sharing that, Ken. I think you had something you wanted to say, Scott.
Well, I wanted, if I could, to briefly talk about a really neglected area, and that is the hearing impaired world. I gave a presentation to Able Australia some time ago. Able Australia is the new name it's the peak body for people with hearing impairment. And it was actually a really fascinating experience because there were about 30 hearing impaired people in the room, and there would have been quite possibly a comparable number of interpreters. And there were two types of interpreters. So for some, about half of the people in the room, they had sight or sufficient sight in which the interpreter, in Australia's case, could use Auslan, which is the sign language name here in Australia. I think sign language, as far as I know, varies from country to country. But there was another half, and a lot of them had a condition called Usher syndrome. Now, Usher syndrome is not very well known, but I think it's really relevant here because Usher syndrome was a condition whereby a person is born with hearing impairment, or certainly very early on in infancy, and then slowly over time, one's vision starts to fail too. And so in those instances, you can't use Auslan or the sign language. So these interpreters were holding on the hand of the person with the dual sensory condition, and they were communicating in a tactile manner, a bit like Helen Keller. And I think the things that were, and that in itself was really fascinating, not coming from a hearing impaired world. I do come from a vision impaired family, but that was quite a new experience for me. And we discovered through that session that I think it was 8 or 9 people of those 30 strongly believed, on the basis of what was presented and the questions they were asking and the answers they were getting, that they had Charles Bonnet. And at least half of them had no idea of such a name. No one had ever mentioned it. And I think Eva brought up a very poignant point about we as a society need to lift our game when it comes to vision impairment. And I think I've come to realise that, especially when it comes to Usher syndrome, that there are a sizable proportion of the hearing impaired community who are also susceptible to Charles Bonnet. And I don't think, if we're talking about the frustrations of not being able to reach people who acquire vision impairment, I think it's further compounded for the hearing impaired world. There's actually a woman who I've met who has Usher syndrome, and she's written on her experiences of Charles Bonnet. If anyone were to go on our website and go back to previous stories, you would find some of the material on her experiences. And she's an academic at the University of Sydney, and she's just written a book called Dual Sensory Impairment and the Older Person. So really trying to encapsulate not only her lived experience, but I think but extending it out and realizing, which I think a lot of us have, anyone who's entered into an aged care facility to meet residents will notice that a lot of people with vision impairment and or hearing impairment, that a lot of the staff and the services provided there are not that responsive to their needs. And so that is yet another big gap that exists that really needs to be addressed. Now, in November this year in Sydney, they're going to be holding, I believe, the first ever dual sensory impairment convention. And in that book that she wrote, she devoted one whole chapter of that to Charles Bonnet. So I think that's another really interesting area that I think really needs to be delved into a lot more.
That is great. And Australia is really leading the way. If this is, in fact, the first convention where they have dual sensory, and so many people are doing great things there. So definitely. It looks like you had a question or response, Eva?
Just to piggyback off of what Scott is saying, that we have people in support group who have a hearing impairment that also have a visual impairment, and they're getting an auditory component, which we know there is no auditory component to Charles Bonnet syndrome. So again, in the words of Judith Potts, two things could be true at once. That fathom the hearing loss could be musical ear, and you have Charles Bonnet syndrome. As people age, their hearing will usually decline as well as their vision. But again, we don't want to make this just about the 55 and older baby boomer demographic. We want to make it about everybody, because there are children who have Usher syndrome. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because we need to pay attention to other sensory deprivation that might be going on with Charles Bonnet syndrome. It makes me wonder about people who may be paralyzed that have Charles Bonnet syndrome. Or we definitely have somebody in our support group, and when he wears his hearing aid, he doesn't get the auditory component. But if he doesn't have his hearing aid in, then that auditory component is very strong. He feels like his hallucinations are interacting with him, or that he can hear them speaking, and it's very disturbing for him. So it's really important to pay attention to that. So I'm glad you brought that up, Scott. And that's all. I just wanted to say that for people in the CBS community that have a hearing loss, try and get a hearing aid or improve your hearing. And that component should, from what we've experienced, I'm not a doctor or medical professional, but we have experienced in our support group that if they get their auditory hearing aid, or if that improves on some level, it'll help with that auditory component.
One thing, I'm just curious, Scott, if someone is listening to this podcast and they live in Australia, are there any support groups, like virtual support groups that meet like bi-weekly or something that they can attend and get support? Any that you're aware of?
Nothing regular at the moment. We find that we're pretty busy at the moment just with undertaking home visits, actually going out and meeting people in their home environments. So that takes up a lot of our time. And if they're in other parts of the country, then we're either doing phone calls or Zoom calls or things like that. But no, we have them spasmodically, but we just don't. I think all of the organizations that currently exist around the world, we're probably small in nature, and where I think Eva alluded to public donations, and so we certainly have an issue with the lack of resources. If we had more resources, we would definitely be doing something like that, but we're spreading our resources as best we can at the moment.
Okay. And phone calls and home visits are important. Thank you for doing that. But I did want everybody to share their website or their contact information in case anyone is listening and wanted to contact you. Could you start, Scott, by maybe sharing your website and contact or anything you want to share?
Yes, ours is quite easy. It's just charlesbonnetsyndrome.org, O-R-G. Obviously with the word at the start. But I think that's become a bit redundant these days, hasn't it?
And sometimes you don't need that now. You can just type it in and it pops right up sometimes. But it's good to know. He's referring to the www.charlesbonnet syndrome.
We do intend in the very near future to present as a minimum one of those vignettes that Vicki had done. and that will make it on the website, and we will do it through our Facebook and we've got two Facebooks. We've got a general one and we've got a private community. So that's not open to the public, and we'll be streaming them on there too in the near future. And let's see, as I said, hopefully that can be the blueprint going forward.
That'll be great to see that. What about yourself, Eva? Any contact information?
Our website, Shaimond, is www. Carmel's Light, and that's MaryCarmelsLight.com, MaryCarmelsLight.com. We also have a helpline for anybody who wants to find out how to join our support groups, who finds themselves in crisis, people living with Charles Bonnet Syndrome, as well as their caregivers. We respond to phone calls for both. Or if you just have questions about CBS, and that number is 704-389-0160. And we try to get to every phone call. If we don't call you back, leave a message and we will return your call. Just clearly leave your name and phone number or your email address, and we will get back to you. Those are our resources right now.
I should just add that both Esme's umbrella and the foundation here in Australia, we also both have national helplines. I don't claim to recall the number in the UK. I won't share the number here, but if you just Google Charles Bonnet Syndrome Foundation, that will lead you to the website, and the phone number is on the homepage.
Feel free to share anything you'd like to, Ken or Antoinette. And maybe you could even talk about Dr. Gary Cusick's support group, because you're regular attendees there. And I know you can definitely share information on how people could get connected with that, in addition to your own works, whatever you'd like to share.
Dr. Gary Cusick, who is the leader of the support group that we attend. As far as contact information, if you'd like to reach out, you can reach us through Mary Carmel's Light. If you get an email there, I can certainly get that information from Eva. I just want to thank you for having the special 50th podcast. And how exciting is that, man? 50.
Quite an accomplishment, Shaimond. Quite an accomplishment. And I know that your podcast, it has gone global, and that's what we need. We need that global contact, because this isn't just happening in the UK and Australia and the US. This is a global problem. And I'm very curious how this is going to evolve. I'm sure there are people in those countries. And if you're hearing this and listening to this and you are in other countries and you're thinking about being a trailblazer where you are, contact us, because that's how I did it. That's how Judith did it. I don't know what made Scott start. We're all here in this together, and whatever we can do to support and help each other, we're here for you. I don't know how we can help, but if you don't ask, you don't know. So if somebody's out there listening globally, we're here for you.
And I wanted to say that in every episode's show notes, I write Dr. Gary Cusick's email address and write the time of his support group, because his is weekly and it's 12 p.m. Eastern time. So that is for people that have CBS or anyone that wants to get information about CBS. And then there's one at 1 p.m. Eastern time, and that is for the caregivers. And I think that's so brilliant to be able to have some time to help the people with CBS and the caregivers. And that information, I'm sure, is on Mary Carmel's website also, but it's in the show notes of every single episode here, as well as some information for Scott Muirden's website and information in Australia, Judith Potts for Esme's Umbrella, Mary Carmel's Light, and all the above. So thank you for your time. Thanks for everyone helping with the podcast over the months, and now I can say years. It's been 2023, so it's going on 2 years. And I appreciate your time, and thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy the show, subscribe and rate the podcast. It makes a difference. And if you would like to contact me, you can email me at info@cbsyndromepodcast.com.